Chapter 5 started off with her life after she left the prison, right? Yeah. And we talked about in the beginning, that long paragraph, on how this is harder leaving the prison than it was even going to the scaffold and standing in front of thousands of people. Because the 1,000 eyes on you, or 2,000 eyes, because, 2 eyes, on you was better than leaving the prison and having to know that tomorrow she doesn't get to go hide in the prison, right? She has to face these people and face their looks and face their comments every day for the rest of her life. So then the second, and even in death, remember, because it's going to go on her gravestone, this scarlet letter is. Then the second paragraph was, why doesn't she just leave, right? She could go back to England, take her letter off. She could even just leave this settlement and go off into the forest and live with the natives, or find a different community and take her A off, and no one would know. Yes? She could just take her baby and leave. It would be quite easy. So why does she stay? And the last line of the last paragraph we read was, the chain that bound her here was of iron links and galling to her inmost soul, but could never be broken. So there's something that's holding her here that is too strong, that will never be broken. So no matter what she has to endure here in this community, she can't bring herself to leave.
So why didn't they just get married if they love each other so much? Maybe he's already married. It's the situation's not able to. Yes, Shane?
What page are we on?
46.
46. And where's the paragraph at?
The first start of the paragraph, it's the second paragraph in the page. It might be.
All right, thank you.
It might be 2. Okay.
It might be 2, you said? Okay, I am.
It might be 2. Doubtless it was so. Although she hid the secret from herself and grew pale whenever it struggled out of her heart, like a serpent from its hole, it might be that another feeling kept her within the scene and pathway that had been so fatal. There dwelt, there trod, the feeling of one with whom she deemed herself connected, in a union with, unrecognized on earth, would bring them together before the bar of final judgment, and make that their marriage altar, for a joint futurity of endless retribution. Over and over again, the tempter of souls had thrust this idea upon Hester's contemplation, and laughed at the passionate and desperate joy with which she seized, and then strove to cast it from her. She barely looked the idea in the face, and hastened to bar it in its dungeon. What she compelled herself to believe, what finally she reasoned upon her motive for continuing a resident of New England, was half a truth and half a self-delusion. Here, she said to herself, had been the scene of her guilt, and here should be the scene of her earthly punishment. And so, perchance, the torture of her daily shame would at length purge her soul and work out another purity than that which she had lost, a more saint-like, because the result of martyrdom. So here is where she sinned, so here is where she must pay penitence and do all the good acts she can do to try to purge her sin. But the real reason, the reason she will not allow herself to deal with is, yes, she loves someone here. And every time she thinks of it, it's like the devil's putting the thought in her mind that, well, maybe after death you can be together. And then he takes that away because they sin so much. Are they going to be allowed to be together after death?
No.
So she won't allow herself to think of it, but the real reason she's staying is the guy.
Be with baby dad.
But, well, never be with him. That's not allowed. She can't even let herself think that because it's not allowed. But it's the real reason. But she's going to tell herself the reason she's staying is to make up for her sin by doing whatever necessary in the place where she sinned. So we are going to read about what she does to make up for her sin. Hester Prynne, therefore, did not flee. On the outskirts of town, within the verge of the peninsula, but not in close vicinity to any other habitation, there was a small thatched cottage. It had been built by an earlier settler and abandoned because the soil about it was too sterile for cultivation, while its comparative remoteness put it out of the sphere of that social activity which already marked the habits of the immigrants. It stood on the shore, looking across the basin of the sea at the forest-covered hills toward the west. A clump of scrubby trees, such as alone grew on the peninsula, did not so much conceal the cottage from view as seemed to denote that here was some object which would fain have been, or at least ought to be, concealed. In this little lonesome dwelling, with some slender means that she possessed, and by the license of the magistrates, who still kept an inquisitorial watch over her, Hester established herself with her infant child. A mystic shadow of suspicion immediately attached itself to the spot. Children, too young to comprehend wherefore this woman should be shut out from the sphere of human charities, would creep nigh enough to behold her plying at her needle at the cottage window, or standing in the doorway, or laboring in her little garden, or coming forth along the pathway that led townward, and discerning the scarlet letter on her breast, would scamper off with a strange, contagious fear. So she's not welcomed in the community, even though she's still part of the community. So she finds a little small cottage on the outskirts of town that's been abandoned. It's out by the water. It doesn't have good soil around it. That's why they left it. And it's got these scrubby-looking trees. Like someone wanted to hide this cottage, or it should be hid, but it's not. It's not this beautiful place. And it's just enough outside of town that she's outside of the community, right? Even though she's in, she's out. The shunning, right? And she had to get the okay from the magistrates because they still keep watch over her after this sin. But this is where she has built a place, not literally, but built her home for her and her daughter. So, and this is kind of like the spooky place outside of town. These children don't know why she's out here, but it's like the place to go when you're playing, and go and see if you can catch a look at this lady with an A on her chest for some reason. And when you see her and she starts coming, you have to laugh because, I mean, it's like not the witch outside of town, but kind of. You understand why these kids are fascinated with her. Doesn't really help her any, but... Lonely as was Hester's situation, and without a friend on earth who dared to show himself, she, however, incurred no risk of want. She possessed an art that sufficed, even in a land that afforded comparatively little scope for its exercise, to supply food for her thriving infant and herself. It was the art, then, as now, almost the only one within a woman's grasp, of needlework. So the art of a woman, pretty much is what it's saying, that she was very good at embroidery, which we know. And because of her skill, she was able to provide for her and her daughter. Whatever they needed, she was able to provide because people would pay her for her work. She bore on her breast, in the curiously embroidered letter, a specimen of her delicate and imaginative skill, of which the dames of a court might gladly have availed themselves, to add the richer and more spiritual adornment of human ingenuity to their fabrics of silk and gold. Here, indeed, in the sable simplicity that generally characterized the puritanic modes of dress, there might be an infrequent call for the finer productions of her handiwork. So it's not all the time, right? But there are occasions where these people of the Puritan mode do want fancy. And remember, we talked about how only certain people would have the fancy, the higher up people, hypocrisy. Talked about that a little bit. Yet the taste of the age, demanding whatever was elaborate in compositions of this kind, did not fail to extend its influence over our stern progenitors, who had cast behind them so many fashions which it might seem harder to dispense with. Public ceremonies, such as ordinations, the installation of magistrates, and all that could give majesty to the forms in which a new government manifested itself to the people, were, as a matter of policy, marked by a stately and well-conducted ceremonial and a somber but yet a studied magnificence. Deep ruffs, painfully wrought bands, and gorgeously embroidered gloves were all deemed necessary to the official state of men assuming the reins of power, and were readily allowed to individuals dignified by rank or wealth, even while the sumptuary laws forbade these and similar extravagances to the plebeian order. So the law says that if you're wealthy or have a high rank, you can wear these fancy things to dignify your rank, to signify that you are of a higher rank. But if you're just the common people, don't even try to wear anything fancy. Makes sense, right? In the array of funerals, too, whether for the apparel of the dead body or to typify by manifold emblematic devices of sable cloth and snowy lawn the sorrows of the survivors, there was a frequent and characteristic demand for such labor as Hester Prynne could supply. Baby linen, for babies then wore robes of state, afforded still another possibility of toil and emoluments. By degrees, not very slowly, her handiwork became what would now be termed the fashion. Whether from commiseration for a woman of so miserable a destiny, or from the morbid curiosity that gives a fictitious value even to common or worthless things, or by whatever other intangible circumstances was then, as now, sufficient to bestow on some persons what others might seek in vain, or because Hester really filled in a gap which must otherwise have remained vacant, it is certain that she had readily and fairly requited employment for as many hours as she saw fit to occupy with her needle. So whether it was because people wanted something to make her work, whether it was because, it was only a few people had her work and it was in the fashion, or because she was really quite good at what she did, she had as many hours of embroidery as she wanted to do. So she had as many jobs as she wanted. She could make a pretty good living, right? If she wanted, she could make as much money as she wants. And for babies, funerals, the higher up government officials, those sorts of things. Vanity, it may be, chose to mortify itself by putting on, for ceremonials of pomp and state, the garments that had been wrought by her sinful hands. Her needlework was seen on the ruff of the governor, military men wore it on their scarves, and the minister on his band. It decked the baby's little cap. It was shut up to be mildewed and molder away in the coffins of the dead. But it is not recorded that in a single instance her skill was called in to embroider the white veil which was to cover the pure blushes of a bride. The exception indicated that ever-relentless vigor with which society frowned upon her sin. Did she ever embroider for a bride? No. Why would they not want her to sew for a wedding?
Because she's too good.
Well, she is good.
She avoided the wedding and went straight to it.
Well, whether she avoided it or they didn't want her to do it, right? Because her sin might rub off on my veil, or the husband might rub off on my wife's veil, and she might not be faithful.
Take my husband from me.
Maybe. But Hester sought not to acquire anything beyond substance of the plainest and most aesthetic description for herself, and a simple abundance for her child. She only got exactly what she needed, no more for herself, and a little bit more than needed for her daughter, but not much. Just a little abundance. Did she have the capability to become rich off of this?
Yeah.
But she did not. Her own dress was of the coarsest materials and the most somber hue, with only that one ornament, the scarlet letter, which it was her doom to wear. The child's attire, on the other hand, was distinguished by a fanciful, or we may rather say, a fantastic ingenuity, which served indeed to heighten the airy charm that early began to develop itself in the little girl, but which appeared to have also a deeper meaning. We may speak further of it hereafter. So Hester's dress is not a comfortable material. It's of the dark hue. The only pretty thing she has on is the scarlet letter. Her daughter, on the other hand, has a beautiful dress, which has a deeper meaning, but we'll bring that up soon, but not yet. But she has a very pretty dress. So we know that as a mother, she gives more to her daughter than she worries about for herself, right? Except for that small expenditure in the decoration of her infant, Hester bestowed all her superfluous means on charity. So anything extra she has, she gives to charity. On wretches less miserable than herself, and who not unfrequently insulted the hand that fed him. Are they nice to her? They insult the hand that feeds them. They are mean to her. The people that she gives money to. People that she, helps feed. People are mean to her. Even the people she helps. Much of the time, which she might readily have applied to the better efforts of her art, she employed in making coarse garments for the poor. It is probable that there was an idea of penance in this mode of occupation, and that she offered up a real sacrifice of enjoyment in devoting so many hours to rude handiwork. She had in her nature a rich, voluptuous, oriental characteristic, a taste for the gorgeously beautiful, which, save in the exquisite productions of her needle, found nothing else in all the possibilities of her life to exercise it upon. So she likes very pretty things, and she's very good at making pretty things, but she enjoys it. So instead, she spends most of her time, besides the little bit of time she needs to make these nice things for other people to make enough money to survive, making clothes for the poor who are rude to her. Women derive a pleasure incomprehensible to the other sex from the delicate toil of the needle. So men don't understand why women like it so much. Well, not all women, but Hester likes it so much to sew. To Hester Prynne, it might have been a mode of expressing and therefore soothing the passion of her life. Like all other joys, she rejected it as a sin. It's enjoyable, so it's sinful. Her embroiderment is sinful because she enjoys it too much. So she only does it when she needs to make money. This morbid meddling of the conscience with the immaterial matter betokened, it is to be feared, no genuine and steadfast penitence, but something doubtful, something that might be deeply wrong beneath. So there's something wrong with her that she likes it so much, so she only does it as needed. Makes sense, right? If you really enjoy something, there's something wrong with it. And their thinking, though, there was something wrong with it. In this matter, Hester Prynne came to have a part to perform in the world. With her native energy of character and rare capacity, it could not entirely cast her off, although it set a mark upon her, more intolerable to a woman's heart than which branded the brow of Cain. In all her intercourse with society, however, there was nothing that made her feel as if she belonged to it. So they needed her, and they needed her work, so they couldn't just kick her out. And plus, that's not the Christian thing to do, to kick her out. But she never feels as if she belongs. And now we're going to read how they treat her. Every gesture, every word, and even the silence of those with whom she came in contact implied and often expressed that she was banished, and as much alone as if she inhabited another sphere, or communicated with the common nature by other organs and senses than the rest of humankind. She stood apart from moral interests, yet close beside them, like a ghost that revisits the familiar fireside, and can no longer make itself seen or felt, no more smile with a household joy, nor mourn with the kindred sorrow, or should it succeed in manifesting its forbidden sympathy, awakening only terror and horrible repugnance. So she's almost like a ghost that sees everything and is always around, but it's never part of anything. She's never able to feel welcomed in anything. These emotions, in fact, and its bitterest scorn besides, seemed to be the sole portion that she retained in the universal heart. It was not an age of delicacy, and her position, although she understood it well, and was in little danger of forgetting it, was often brought before her vivid self-perception, like a new anguish by the rudest touch upon the tenderest spot. So, she's constantly jabbed in her sin, right? She has to wear the scarlet letter, but not only that, but daily hourly, when she's around people, they don't let her forget it. But whether it's by what they say, what they don't say, what they look at her, and it doesn't get better over time. You know, people say you harden over time. It's not getting better for her. It hurts worse every time because people should be getting better over time, right? But they are not. The poor, as we have already said, whom she sought to be the objects of her bounty, often reviled the hands that was stretched forth to succor them. Dames of elevated rank, likewise, whose doors she entered in her occupation, were accustomed to distill drops of bitterness into her heart, sometimes through the alchemy of quiet malice, by which women can concoct a subtle poison from ordinary trifles, and sometimes also by a coarser expression that fell upon the sufferer's defenseless breast like a rough blow upon an ulcerated wound. So the poor are outwardly rude to her. The people that she works for, the women, girls, well, and boys too, but you know how women can be quietly awful just by a look. She gets those all the time from these women. And it might be an underhanded comment that came out as a nice comment, but you know it's not a nice comment. She gets these blows all the time. And then the worst one is when someone just openly stares at the scarlet letter in a way of judgment. So people overall, people that she helps and that she works with, that she works for, are openly mean. And that would be a lot to take day after day, right? Especially when she has no one to talk to. Hester had schooled herself long and well, and she never responded to these attacks, save by a flush of crimson that rose irrepressibly over her pale cheek, and again subsided into the depths of her bosom. She was patient, a martyr indeed, but she forbore to pray for enemies, lest in spite of her forgiving aspirations, the words of the blessing should stubbornly twist themselves into a curse. So she never responds to quiet attacks or outward attacks, save for either the blushing, if it was something embarrassing, or the anger in her cheeks. She presses that down, doesn't say anything, doesn't let them know that they got to her. She goes home, and instead of saying bad things about these people, she prays for them because she doesn't want their bad things and the way they treated her to ruin her even more than it already has. So she goes home and she prays for them. Has she turned into, I'm not saying she was a bad person before, but has she turned into a pretty good person? She gives everything extra, all of her time, all of her money to the poor. When people are outwardly rude to her, she goes home and she prays for their soul. That's a pretty good person. I don't know about you, but I don't think I would be able to be that good of a person. I hope I would, but I don't think I would be able to do that, to just deal with all of this. Continually, and in 1,000 other ways, did she feel the innumerable throbs of anguish that had been so cunningly contrived for her by the undying, the ever-active sentence of the Puritan tribunal. Clergymen paused in the streets to address words of exhortation that brought a crowd with its mingled grin and frown around the poor, sinful woman. Walking down the street, and someone from the church comes along and stops her and starts preaching about her, drawing a crowd. And about her sin, and she just has to stand there and deal with it. Cool. If she entered a church, trusting to share the Sabbath smile of the universal Father, it was often her mishap to find herself the text of discourse. So she walks into church expecting, to be there to hear the Holy Gospel. Instead, she gets a sermon on her and her sin. So everywhere she goes, bless you. She grew to have a dread of children, for they imbibed from their parents a vague idea of something horrible in this dreary woman gliding silently through town, with never any companion but one only child. Therefore, first allowing her to pass, they pursued her at a distance with shrill cries, and the utterance of a word that had no distinct purport to their own minds, but was none the less terrible to her, as proceeding from lips that babbled it unconsciously. It seemed to argue so wide a diffusion of her shame that all nature knew of it, it could have caused her no deeper pang had the leaves of the trees whispered the dark story among themselves, had the summer breeze murmured about it, had the wintry blast shrieked it aloud. So the children are awful because they don't quite understand, but they know there's something wrong with her, and they've heard their parents use a word at home, probably adulteress, right? Because would a kid know what that means? Would they understand what she had done? No, but I'm going to go after you and taunt you far enough behind that it's just digging those burrs in. Would you come to not like children around you either? If this was a constant thing? Yeah. Another peculiar torture was felt in the gaze of a new eye. When strangers looked curiously at the scarlet letter, and none ever failed to do so, they branded it afresh in Hester's soul, so that oftentimes she could scarcely refrain, yet always did refrain, from covering the symbol with her hand. But then again, an accustomed eyes had likewise its own anguish to inflict. Its cool stare of familiarity was intolerable. From first to last, in short, Hester Prynne had always this dreadful agony in feeling a human eye upon the token. The spot never grew callous. It seemed, on the contrary, to grow more sensitive with daily torture. So as I said, instead of hardening to this over time, it's getting worse. And new people that have never seen her before stare at her because why does this woman have a scarlet letter A on her chest? But then the people around town still stare at it. So it's not getting better, and people are not treating her better over time like they should, right? Then there's other things that happen, but sometimes, once in many days, or perchance in many months, she felt an eye, a human eye, upon the ignominious brand that seemed to give a momentary relief, as if half her agony were shared. The next instant, back it all rushed again with still a deeper throb of pain, for in that brief interval she had sinned anew. Had Hester sinned alone? So, a briefest moment she gets a little relief when someone looks at her. But in that relief, she's sinning again because she feels relief. Whose eye may this be?
Baby daddy.
It could be the guys, yeah. It also could be another sinner, right? Because, well, people aren't perfect, even though Hester has a feeling she's the only sinner in this world. Her imagination was somewhat affected, and had she been of a softer moral and intellectual fiber, would have been still more so by the strange and solitary anguish of her life, walking to and fro with those lonely footsteps in the little world with which she was outwardly connected, and now and then appeared to Hester, if altogether fancy, it nevertheless too potent to be resisted. She felt or fancied then that the scarlet letter had endowed her with a new sense. She shuddered to believe, yet could not help believing, that it gave her a sympathetic knowledge of the hidden sins in other hearts. She was terror-stricken by the revelations that were thus made. What were they? Could they be other than the insidious whispers of the bad angel who would fain have persuaded the struggling woman, as yet only half of his victim, that the outward guise of purity was but a lie, and that if truth were everywhere to be shown, a scarlet letter would blaze forth on many bosoms besides Hester Prynne's? So the scarlet letter makes her feel like she can feel other people's sins by the way they look at her, like they're not looking at her in judgment, but in, I should have one of those too. And that makes her even more uneasy because is everything a lie? Or should everyone in this village have a scarlet letter? Not obvious in A, but should they all have a letter on their chest to show their sins? And if so, then everything I've ever learned is a lie. That can't be it. That's just the devil trying to win me over. Or must she receive these imitations, so obscure yet so distinct, as truth? In all her miserable experience, there was nothing else so awful and so loathsome as this sense. It perplexed as well as shocked her by the irreverent inopportuneness of the occasions that it brought it into vivid action. Sometimes the red infamy upon her breast would give a sympathetic throb as she passed near a venerable minister or magistrate, the model of piety and justice, to whom the age of antique reverence looked upon as the mortal man in fellowship with angels. So it can't be right when I feel this when I walk by a revered man, like someone who's of the church or of the government. That can't be right. That's just wrong, because they're supposed to be in touch with angels. What evil thing is at hand, would Hester say to herself? Lifting her reluctant eyes, there would be nothing human within the scope of view save the form of this earthly saint.